Well, good morning, everybody. So last week, if you recall, we had the story of Bartimaeus, the outsider, right? The one on the edge of society who becomes a model for all of us, a model of conversion, of what it means to follow Christ by letting go of everything in total surrender to the Lord. This week, as we gather here and continue on our journey through the Gospel of Mark, we're presented with another unlikely model, this scribe. Now, the scribes at the time of Jesus, they were great experts in the law being the Torah, right, the law of Moses. Kind of a separate group from the Pharisees, but some of the scribes were Pharisees themselves. And not only were the scribes great experts, but they were the ones who wrote the documents around marriages and divorces and so on and so forth within the living of that law of Moses. Mark uses the scribes often in his gospel as the antagonists. Matthew likes to use the Pharisees, right? Those who are threatened by Jesus' preaching because the change seems to be opposed to everything that they're about. That if people were to follow Jesus, their way of life would be changed forever. Their influence would disappear. Their power would no longer be existent. And so we have a scribe who's taking a very different approach to Jesus today. We're in chapter 12 of Mark, so a lot of Jesus' preaching and his healings and his other actions are well known. And this scribe's been listening to these words of Jesus. Not just listening, but he wants to understand. He's attracted by the words, the preaching. In short, he's attracted by the truth that Jesus shares. And I've said many times before, truth is one of those roads that leads us to God. And so he starts with a very fundamental understanding, teaching, and prayer of the Jewish faith. Which is the greatest of the commandments? Not asking to trap Jesus, but to come to deeper knowledge. And so Jesus quotes from our first reading today, Deuteronomy. The Lord our God is Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The Shema Israel, an extension and focus of the very first commandment, the center of Jewish belief, that there is only one God, which would have been against some of the cultures at the time of Jesus' preaching, right? But even goes beyond that. Not only is there only one God, but nothing and no one can replace him. Not just any other God, but no other person in our lives or ourselves. Shared this with the Daily Mass crowd the other day. A quote I came across from Chris Stefanik said, the difference between us and God is God knows he's not us. Right? Because this is not a trouble with the spiritual life, is we sometimes get that reversed. Right? We forget who we are. And in doing that, we forget who God is. But nothing else can replace God as well. You know, at the time, the culture, that would have been understood, idols, we don't worship idols. Yes, but in 2024, what idols have replaced God in our lives? Is it money? Things? Video games? Activities? Food? Restaurants? Movies? What is it that gets more of our focus and attention in our lives than God? And the Shema Israel, which is prayed twice a day by the Jewish people, reminds them right off the bat what we're about. We're about honoring the God who is the one God and that we're not only to be aware that he's the only God, but we're to love him with all our heart, mind, soul, being, and strength. Meaning that we have a responsibility and a duty to this God. He's owed our worship and praise, our hearts, our minds, and our very lives. The scribe would have understood this from Jesus, no problem at all, because that's what he had got up that morning praying himself. Jesus goes on, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Again, Jesus is not making up anything. We find this is a quote from Leviticus, right? This is one of the 613 commandments that we find in the Old Testament. And while it's a different kind of linking, it's very much understood by the Jewish people as well. In fact, there was a philosopher, lived about 100 years ago, Martin Buber. I remember reading his book, I, Thou, in seminary. Now, it's been 30 years, so you're taxing the mind here, so this is going to be a very brief summary. But one of his teachings in that book, I, Thou, is we have basically two approaches to life. It could be I, it, myself, and the world, and then we approach it as an it. We approach others even as an it or a commodity, right? We approach the world and other people to get what we want, to get ahead in life. He with the most toys wins. What's Pope Francis' line one time saying? You notice in a funeral procession, there's never a moving van. Right? He with the most toys, who cares? It's not going anywhere. Buber's approach is the other approach is I, Thou, where I live in relationship with the other. I look upon the other with great respect and dignity owed them, that I am walking with them in this journey. And through that I-thou relationship, Buber said, we come to encounter God himself. So when Jesus makes these connections for the scribe, it makes sense. Right? There's some element. Jesus highlights the importance of that and brings that to a new level. And now we know why the scribe is having this great epiphany, this great moment of growth. He repeats what he's just heard, says, "You're right, Lord. In fact, this is so important, it's worth more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." And that's just not a throwaway line. That's a line that we hear often in the Old Testament and from Jesus himself. That what the Lord desires above all else is a contrite, loving heart, he'll say often, more than any ritual or sacrifice that can be offered. The scribe here, Mark is presenting as a great moment of growth, intellectually and spiritually. A sign that he has opened his heart and mind to Jesus. And he's truly listened to understand. He didn't listen to refute. That's how we listen in 2024, don't we? We listen so we can refute what you have to say, right? I caught myself on this, a phone call that I didn't, not so much refuting, but someone started to ask me a question. I assumed what he was asking and kind of answered a totally different question, right? We don't listen to what's being communicated. We don't listen from the heart, from a place of respect, from a place of love. And when the scribe does that, he's on his way to becoming a disciple of the Lord himself, just like Bartimaeus did in last week's account. The scribe is willing to let go of what he knew. Just like Bartimaeus was, he cast aside his cloak because it's getting in the way of getting to Jesus, right? Bartimaeus is willing to cast away the only thing he owns to go to Jesus. The scribe himself is doing that with what he knew, what he was holding on to, his knowledge. To throw that aside, to grow deeper in knowledge of the truth, and more importantly, to grow in his relationship with the Lord himself. A moment of great and powerful spiritual growth. Benedict XVI preached on this gospel and tied it into what we just celebrated the other day, All Saints' Day. The Holy Father preached, "The saints are those who, trusting God's grace, try to live according to that fundamental law: love God, love neighbor." And one of those saints, within the lifetime of most of us here, St. Teresa of Calcutta, Mother Teresa, wrote, "We are commanded to love God and our neighbor equally, on the same level. There is no difference," she said, "and we don't have to search for opportunities. We have them 24 hours a day with those around us." And Pope Francis would add to that, not just those we like, and not just those who are friends or family, but all those that we encounter, even those who hate us. So our challenge by the simple message this week, the challenge by the example of the scribe in the gospel is, how are we going to live this love of God and love of neighbor in the week ahead? How can we allow ourselves to be challenged, just like the scribe, by this teaching? And what do we need to let go of to take our love of God and our love of neighbor to the next level?